Welcome to a deep dive where we are going to plunge into a truly fascinating and, well, pretty complex period of history using the stack of sources you've shared with us.
Yeah, we're talking about roughly 1,500 years. After the decline of the Harappan civilization, it's a long stretch.
A very long stretch leading up to this major turning point around the 6th century BCE.
Exactly. And that turning point, it really marks the emergence of the first states, powerful empires, kingdoms across the Indian subcontinent.
But it's not just about the rulers, is it? The sources point to much more going on.
Oh, definitely. This era also saw profound economic and social changes, shifts in how people farmed, how they traded, how society itself was organized. Big changes.
Okay, so our mission in this deep dive, what are we trying to achieve? Using these sources, you've provided this mix of inscriptions, texts, coins, archaeological finds.
Well, the goal is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, really, to unpack the key developments.
And also, I think, to understand the historian's craft. How do scholars even begin to piece this history together from clues that are often fragmented, maybe even biased?
That's crucial. What can these ancient sources really tell us? About the kings, sure, but also about the farmers in the fields, the merchants on the move.
Because the sources themselves, they give us glimpses, invaluable ones, but they don't tell the whole story, do they?
Not at all. And certainly not from everyone's perspective.
Yeah.
That's a key limitation we have to keep in mind.
Okay, so let's set the scene first. After the Harappan civilization declines, what does the subcontinent look like in that immediate aftermath?
Right, so after the Harappans, maybe mid-second millennium BCE onwards, the landscape changes. You have the Rig Veda being composed, for instance, by groups along the Indus and its tributaries, and elsewhere, new agricultural settlements are popping up. We see evidence in North India, down in the Deccan, parts of Karnataka.
So farming is spreading, adapting.
Yes. And there's also pretty clear archaeological evidence for significant populations of pastoralists, people moving with their herds, especially in the Deccan and further south. It's a real mosaic.
And it's during the later part of this period in Central and South India that we start seeing something really distinct emerge. The megaliths.
Ah, yes, the megaliths.
Yeah.
From about the first millennium BCE, you get these elaborate stone structures, often associated with burials.
Okay, so monuments, graves, what's inside?
Well, what's fascinating is that many contain iron tools and weapons alongside the human remains.
Iron. That feels significant.
It's key archaeological evidence. It suggests major cultural shifts were underway, and importantly, it shows the arrival and the increasing use of iron technology. Iron becomes absolutely critical for what happens next.
Which brings us right to that pivotal moment we mentioned earlier, the 6th century BCE. What makes this century such a watershed?
Things really accelerate here.
Yeah.
It's widely seen as a turning point because you see major changes happening almost concurrently.
Like what specifically?
Well, you get the emergence of the earliest states and cities. Not just settlements, but organized political entities, urban centers.
Okay, states and cities.
Plus, growing evidence everywhere for the widespread use of iron impacting farming, warfare. And crucially, this is when coinage starts to develop. Proper coins.
Ah, coinage. That must have changed trade significantly.
Huge impact on economic exchange, yeah. Facilitated things on a whole new level.
So political changes, economic shifts, and didn't you say something about new ideas too?
Absolutely. This era also sees the rise of influential, diverse systems of thought that challenge the old ways. Most famously, Buddhism and Jainism. It's a period of intense intellectual and spiritual innovation alongside everything else.
Wow, so much going on. Given this explosion of activity, how do historians actually manage to reconstruct what was happening back then? It must be like assembling a giant puzzle with missing pieces.
It is exactly like that. And the historian's craft here is all about drawing together clues from these multiple, often challenging sources.
So inscriptions, writings on stone or metal.
Right. Then ancient texts, religious, literary, administrative ones, though many are fragile. Coins, which are tiny but packed with info. And then, of course, archaeology, where we dig up.
And you have to cross-reference everything.
Constantly. Interpreting these very different types of evidence, each with its own slant, its own limitations. It's a complex process.
Speaking of deciphering clues, there was that huge breakthrough in the 1830s, wasn't there? Something that really changed the game for studying this era.
Oh, absolutely. This is where it gets really exciting. The work of James Prinsep in the 1830s was transformative.
He worked at the Mint, right, but was also a scholar.
Exactly. An officer in the East India Company's Mint, but a brilliant linguist and antiquarian. He managed to decipher Brahmi and Kharosthi.
The main scripts used back then.
The scripts used in the earliest inscriptions and on the earliest coins, yes. Cracking those was monumental.
Wow. So what did he find once he could read them?
It was electrifying. He discovered most of these inscriptions referred to a king using titles like Piedasi, meaning pleasant to behold.
Okay, a title.
But then, and this was the key, he found a few inscriptions that used that same title, but also explicitly named the king as Asoka.
Basoka, who was known from Buddhist texts, right?
And precisely. Suddenly, historians had a direct link between a figure known from literature and numerous physical inscriptions spread across the subcontinent. It connected the dots.
That must have just blown the field wide open.
It gave a completely new direction for studying early Indian political history. Scholars, both European and Indian, could suddenly use these inscriptions alongside texts to trace the lineages of major dynasties. By the early 20th century, the broad outlines of political history were becoming much clearer.
So the initial focus, understandably, was very much on the politics, the kings, the empires.
Yes, that was the primary goal, given what the most abundant deciphered sources the inscriptions seem to reveal first: kings and dynasties.
But scholarship evolves.
It does. Later on, historians started digging deeper, investigating the links between these political shifts and the economic and social changes happening at the same time.
And were the links straightforward? Big empire equals prosperity for all.
Huh? Not quite. They quickly realized the connections were complex, often indirect. You couldn't just assume political power automatically translated into, say, widespread economic well-being. It's much more nuanced.
You keep mentioning inscriptions. Just so we're clear, what exactly are they and why are they so vital as a source?
Good question. Basically, inscriptions are writings engraved on hard surfaces. Stone is common, but also metal, like copper plates or even pottery sometimes.
Like permanent records.
Exactly. Think of them that way. Often commissioned by rulers or wealthy individuals or religious groups to commemorate achievements, record donations, announce royal orders, proclaim ideals, things they wanted to last.
And they survive better than, say, writing on palm leaves.
Much better. Stone and metal endure. And sometimes we can even get an idea of their date from the style of the script itself that's called paleography. Epigraphists study those changes in writing styles over time.
What language were the earliest ones in?
The earliest inscriptions we have are mostly in Prakrit.
Prakrit, not Sanskrit.
Not initially, no. Prakrit wasn't one single language, more like a group term for the various related languages spoken by ordinary people across different regions. Later on, you do start getting inscriptions and texts in Pali, Tamil, and Sanskrit as well.
Okay, got it. So Princeps cracks the code, and historians can now read about those early states emerging back in the 6th century BCE, the Mahajanapadas.
Precisely. Early Buddhist and Jaina texts list 16 of these great realms, or Mahajanapadas, as the most important states around that time.
Any names we'd recognize?
Oh yeah, some pop up frequently in the lists, though the lists themselves can vary a bit. Names like Vaji, Magadha, Koshala, Kuru, Panchala, Gandhara, Avanti. These are the major players.
What's interesting is that they weren't all run the same way, were they? It wasn't just kings everywhere.
That's a really key point. Most were monarchies, yes, ruled by kings, but some were quite different. They were known as Ganas or Sanghas.
Ganas and Sanghas, like oligarchies.
Essentially, yes. Power was shared among a group of men, often called Rajas themselves. In some cases, like the Vaji Sangha, these Rajas might have even controlled resources, like land, collectively.
That's fascinating. And didn't some major religious figures come from these?
Strikingly, yes. Both Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, and the Buddha came from such Ganas. It shows there was real political diversity right from the start.
And these states, monarchies or oligarchies, they had capital cities, often fortified.
Yes, each typically had a capital, and fortifications suggest defense was a major concern. These were consolidating centers of power.
Which implies they needed resources to maintain them. Armies, maybe officials.
Absolutely. Maintaining fortified cities, funding armies, however basic, and perhaps the beginnings of administrative structures, all that required significant resources. Which immediately makes you ask, where did they get them?
And the sources offer some clues there.
They do. Around the same time, from the 6th century BCE, we see Brahmanas compiling Sanskrit texts called the Dharma Sutras.
Dharma Sutras rule books.
Kind of. They laid down norms for society, including for rulers. Ideally, rulers were expected to be Kshatriyas, and crucially, the Dharma Sutras advised them to collect taxes and tribute.
From whom?
From cultivators, traders, and artisans. Those were seen as the main legitimate sources of state income.
So farmers and city folk, basically. What about people living in the forests or pastoralists moving with herds?
That's much less clear from these texts. How resources were procured from forest dwellers or mobile pastoral groups. The Dharma Sutras are a bit vague on the practicalities there. They focus on the settled agricultural and urban populations.
But they did mention another way for rulers to get wealth.
Oh, yes. Raiding neighboring states was explicitly mentioned as a legitimate way to acquire wealth and resources.
Raiding. So warfare wasn't just political, it was actually part of the economic strategy.
It seems so. It was a recognized method. And to raid effectively or defend against raids, you needed a military force.
Which leads to standing armies.
Gradually, yes. Some states started developing standing armies and more regular bureaucratic systems to manage things. Others probably relied more on militias, often drawn from the farming population when needed.
Now, out of all these Mahajanapadas, one clearly rises above the rest between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, Magadha, in modern Bihar.
Magadha becomes the powerhouse, yes. And what's really interesting is how different explanations are given for its rise. Modern historians tend to look at it one way.
Okay, how do modern historians explain Magadha's dominance?
They usually point to a combination of geographical and economic factors. Magadha was located in the incredibly fertile Ganga Valley, great for agriculture.
Food production.
Exactly. It also had access to rich iron ore deposits nearby, in what's now Jharkhand. So resources for better tools, better weapons, maybe widespread iron plows earlier than elsewhere.
Iron and food. What else?
Elephants. The forests in the region had large elephant populations, and elephants were a crucial part of ancient Indian armies like tanks. And finally, the Ganga River itself and its tributaries provided cheap, efficient routes for transport and communication, location, resources, connectivity.
So, a material explanation, how did the ancient writers see it? The Buddhist and Jaina texts you mentioned.
They often attributed Magadha's success much more to the qualities of its individual rulers. They highlight the ambition, the ruthlessness, the effectiveness of kings like Bimbisara, Ajatasattu, Mahapadmananda, and the skill of their ministers. It's more about leadership and policy.
Interesting contrast. People versus circumstances. And Magadha's capital moved too, didn't it? For strategic reasons.
Yes. Initially, it was Rajagaha. The name means House of the King. It was a fortified settlement nestled among hills, probably chosen for defense.
Makes sense.
But later, in the 4th century BCE, the capital shifted to Pataliputra, which is modern Patna. This was a really strategic move because Pataliputra sat right on the Ganga, commanding communication routes across a vast area. Control the river, control the movement.
And the growth of Magadha eventually leads to the first really large-scale empire that we see clearly in the sources, the Mauryan Empire.
That's right. Founded by Chandragupta Maurya around 321 BCE, building directly on that Magadhan power base. He expanded control massively.
And his grandson was Asoka, the one Princep identified.
The very same. Asoka, who reigned roughly 272 or 268 down to 231 BCE, further consolidated and expanded the empire, most famously through the conquest of Kalinga, which is coastal Orissa today.
We mentioned the diverse sources earlier. What specifically helps us understand the Mauryans? It sounds like we have more to work with here.
We do, although the puzzle pieces still don't fit perfectly. We have archaeological finds, some really remarkable stone sculptures often associated with the Mauryan court.
Like the pillar capitals.
Exactly. We also have fragments of accounts written by foreigners, like Megasthenes, who was a Greek ambassador to Chandragupta's court. He gives an outsider's view.
And that famous text, the Arthashastra?
Yes, the Arthashastras. It's a treatise on statecraft, traditionally attributed to Kautilya or Chanakya, said to be Chandragupta's chief minister. It offers insights into administration, economy, military strategy. Though dating parts of it is debated, some sections definitely seem relevant.
And later literature, too.
Lots of it. Buddhist, Jaina, Puranic texts, Sanskrit works. They all contain narratives and traditions about the Mauryan dynasty.
But Asoka's inscriptions, you said they are particularly valuable.
They really are among the most valuable sources, because they are contemporary from his actual reign. They're found on rocks and beautifully polished pillars across his vast territory. And they are essentially the king's own words directed to his subjects and officials.
And his unique approach was using these permanent inscriptions to broadcast his message.
Exactly. He seems to have been the first major ruler in the region to use stone surfaces so extensively to propagate his ideas and policies. He used them to proclaim his concept of Dhamma.
Dhamma. What exactly was that? Was it a specific religion he was promoting?
It's generally understood not as a religion in itself, but more as a set of ethical principles and social responsibilities he wanted everyone to follow.
Like what kind of principles?
Things like showing respect to elders, being generous towards brahmanas and other religious ascetics, treating servants and slaves kindly, and importantly, showing tolerance and respect for other people's religious traditions.
So, more of a moral code for social harmony.
Precisely. It seems aimed at fostering unity and well-being across his very diverse empire, rather than promoting one specific sect.
And these inscriptions weren't just in one language or script.
No, reflecting the empire's diversity.
Yeah.
Most were in Prakrit, using the Brahmi script, across the main part of the empire. But up in the northwest, closer to Greek and Persian influence, you find inscriptions in Aramaic and Greek, as well as Prakrit, written in the Kharosthi script.
That tells you something about their reach, doesn't it? How did they even administer such a huge territory? The inscriptions mention several key centers.
Yes, the main capital was Pataliputra, but the inscriptions name 4 major provincial centers: Taxila in the northwest, Ujjayini in the west, Tosali in the east, Kalinga, and Suvarnagiri in the south.
Looking at a map, those are incredibly spread out, and the terrain is so varied. Mountains, coasts, plains. Could they really have had a uniform system of administration across all that?
That's the big question historians grapple with. And the growing consensus is, probably not. Uniform control seems unlikely.
So, stronger control near the centers.
Probably. Control was likely strongest near the capital and these provincial hubs, and their locations seem strategic. Taxila and Ujjayini were on major long-distance trade routes vital for economy and movement. Suvarnagiri means golden mountain, which suggests it might have been important for accessing gold mines, perhaps in Karnataka.
Holding it all together must have depended heavily on communication and the military.
Absolutely critical. Journeys between these centers could take weeks, even months, relying on land and river roads. So maintaining communication was key, and a formidable army was essential.
Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador, wrote about the Mauryan military, didn't he?
He did. He described a military committee with 6 subcommittees. It sounds quite organized.
6 subcommittees for what?
1 for the navy, 1 each for infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. And crucially, a 6th one responsible for transport and provisions.
Transport and provisions. That sounds like the unglamorous but essential part. Logistics.
Totally essential. Arranging bullock carts, procuring food for soldiers and animals, recruiting servants and artisans to accompany the army. It highlights the massive logistical operation needed to support such a force.
And Ahsoka's Dhamma, it wasn't just a personal philosophy, it was also a tool of governance, a way to hold the empire together.
It certainly seems that way. Propagating Dhamma, this shared ethical code, looks like a deliberate strategy to create social cohesion and a sense of shared identity across his incredibly diverse population. He even appointed special officials, the Dhamma Mahamata, to travel around and spread the message.
Megasthenes also listed a whole range of tasks handled by the king's officials: supervising rivers, measuring land, inspecting irrigation, managing huntsmen, collecting taxes, overseeing crafts.
It's quite a list. And it makes you think, why would state officials need to supervise, say, woodcutters or blacksmiths?
Maybe controlling resources or taxes.
Likely both. It probably ties back to the state's need for resources, timber, metal perhaps for state projects or the army, and also ensuring taxes were collected from these professions. It suggests a fairly involved bureaucracy, at least in some areas.
The numbers for the Mauryan army mentioned in Greek sources are just huge. 600,000 infantry, 9,000 elephants.
They are staggering figures. Some historians think they might be exaggerated, but even if they're only partly true, imagine the resources needed. Food, fodder, weapons, pay for an army that size. It underlines the economic base required.
You mentioned the Arthashastra having details on capturing elephants.
Yes, it even discusses the practicalities of managing elephant forests and capturing them for the army, showing just how important they were considered.
It's clear why the Mauryan Empire made such a big impression on early historians, especially those writing during the colonial period.
Yes, finding evidence of such a large, seemingly centralized empire in India's past was significant for them. And the archaeological finds, the polished pillars, the sculpture, were seen as proof of a grand imperial culture.
And Ahsoka himself became a kind of ideal figure.
His image, derived from the inscriptions, this powerful ruler who seemingly renounced violence after Kalinga and promoted ethics, was seen as unique and was particularly inspiring to Indian nationalist leaders in the 20th century.
But as impressive as it was, it didn't last forever.
Not even close. The empire lasted only about 150 years, which is actually quite short for such a large entity. It didn't cover the entire subcontinent, and as we discussed, control likely wasn't uniform.
And new powers emerged.
Exactly. By the 2nd century BCE, new chiefdoms and kingdoms were popping up in various regions. The political map was constantly shifting.
So what happens after the Mauryans fade? Does the idea of large states disappear, or do we see new kinds of kingship, new ways of ruling?
We definitely see new political formations and new ideas about what it meant to be a king. Down south, for example, in what the ancient sources call Tamilakam, the Tamil country, we see the emergence of stable and prosperous chiefdoms.
Like the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas.
Those are the main ones mentioned in the early Tamil Sangam literature.
And you mentioned earlier there's a difference between a chiefdom and a kingdom, based on the sources.
Yes, it's a useful distinction historians make based on how the sources describe them. A chief is typically a leader who gets support from their kin group. They lead in war, perform rituals, settle disputes, but crucially, they receive gifts from their followers, not regular taxes, and they usually don't have standing armies or a big bureaucracy.
Whereas a king
is generally associated with collecting regular taxes, maintaining a standing army, and having appointed officials. It suggests a more formalized state structure.
That Tamil poem excerpt you shared from the Silapadakam about the chief Sengutavan getting gifts in the forest, ivory, spices, sandalwood, that illustrates the gift aspect nicely.
It really does. It paints a picture of people bringing valuable goods to the chief, not as a formal tax, but perhaps as tribute or a demonstration of loyalty, maybe expecting protection or redistribution in return. He likely used these gifts to reward his followers, enhance his own prestige, or maybe trade them. It shows different models were operating.
And elsewhere, after the Mauryans, other significant rulers.
Oh yes. In western and central India, you have the Satavahanas who ruled for a long time. And in the northwest and west, groups originally from Central Asia, like the Shakas, established powerful kingdoms.
What was their economic base?
These rulers, the Satavahanas and Shakas particularly, often derived significant revenue from controlling long-distance trade routes that passed through their territories. And interestingly, they often made active efforts to claim high social status, sometimes because their origins weren't from the traditional Kshatriya lineages.
How did they try to boost their status then, if they weren't born rulers in the traditional sense?
One powerful strategy that becomes more visible in this post-Mauryan period is claiming divine connections, associating themselves with gods, divine kingship.
Like the Kushanas, who ruled that huge area from Central Asia into India.
They are a prime example. They ruled around the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, and the evidence for their claims to divinity is quite striking.
What kind of evidence?
Colossal statues of Kushana kings have been found, installed in shrines, almost as if they were deities. Some Kushana rulers also adopted the title Devaputra, son of God.
Son of God, where did that come from?
It was possibly inspired by Chinese rulers who called themselves sons of heaven. It was about projecting an image of being more than just human, having a divine mandate to rule.
So, using religious ideas for political legitimacy, looking at that Kushana coin image you provided, the king on one side, a deity on the other.
Exactly. Or that sandstone sculpture of a Kushana king. Look at the imposing stance, the dress. These visual symbols, combined with titles like Devaputra, were all part of constructing an image of exceptional, divinely sanctioned power.
Why do you think they felt the need to do that? Just ego?
Probably more strategic than just ego. In vast, diverse territories with many competing local powers, claiming divine status could elevate the ruler above rivals, demanding greater loyalty and obedience, and legitimizing their authority, especially if their origins were foreign or unclear.
Okay. Moving forward a few centuries, into the Gupta period, starting around the 4th century CE, we see large empires again. Was their style of rule different?
It seems to have been. The Gupta rulers appear to have relied more on Samantas.
Samantas, who were they?
These were subordinate rulers, local chiefs or kings, who controlled land and resources in their own areas. They acknowledged the Gupta emperor's overlordship, paid homage, offered gifts or tribute, and crucially provided military support when required.
So a bit more decentralized than the Mauryan ideal.
It looks that way, more like a network of alliances and dependencies. And it was fluid. A powerful Samanta could potentially challenge and overthrow a weak emperor. Conversely, a strong emperor could reduce independent kings to the status of Samantas.
What sources help us understand the Guptas? Still inscriptions and coins?
Yes. Literature, coins are important, and inscriptions remain crucial, especially a type called prashastis.
Prashastis. You mentioned those sound like praise poems.
That's exactly what they are. Composed by court poets, usually in Sanskrit, in very elaborate, flattering language, praising the king or patron. The Prayaga Prashasti, composed by Harisena for the Gupta Emperor Samudragupta, is the most famous example.
So we have to read them carefully, not take them literally.
Absolutely. Historians try to extract factual information about campaigns, territories, ancestry, but you also have to remember their primary purpose was glorification. They were meant to impress. They were also valued as works of poetry in their own right.
That excerpt from the Prayaga Prashasti is incredible, comparing Samudragupta to multiple gods.
Isn't it? It says he was equal to the gods Dhanata, Kubera, Varuna, Indra, and Antaka Yama, that he put to shame other kings. It's pure hyperbole. But what does it tell us? Not necessarily about his actual divinity, but about the image the Gupta kings wanted to project. One of overwhelming power, divine favor, unchallenged authority. It reinforces that theme of rulers associating themselves with the divine.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on rulers and states. What about the people actually working the land, the vast majority in the countryside? Do the sources tell us much about their lives, their perspectives?
That's always the challenge, isn't it? Ordinary people, especially rural folk, rarely left their own written accounts. Their voices are much harder to hear directly.
So how do historians try to get at their experiences indirectly?
Exactly. We have to look for clues embedded in other kinds of sources. One useful approach is examining popular stories and fables from the period, like those collected in the Jataka stories about the Buddha's previous lives, or the Panchatantra.
Because they might reflect common experiences or attitudes.
Precisely. Many started as oral tales before being written down, and they often feature ordinary people interacting with kings, tax collectors, merchants, sometimes reflecting social tensions.
That Gandatindu Jataka story you included seems like a perfect example. It describes villagers suffering under a wicked king, bandits by night, tax collectors by day.
It's a very stark portrayal. And what did the villagers do? They abandon their village entirely and flee to the forest to escape the oppression.
What does that story suggest?
It vividly illustrates the potential for a strained relationship between rulers and their subjects, especially rural ones. It shows kings demanding high taxes likely needed for those armies and courts we talked about. It shows peasants feeling oppressed. And crucially, it suggests that flight, escaping royal control by moving to the fringes, was a recognized option, a form of resistance.
To get those taxes, rulers needed agriculture to be productive. What strategies were used to increase food production in the countryside?
Several key things were happening. One major development was the increased use of the iron-tipped plowshare.
The iron plow, where was it most effective?
Especially in the fertile alluvial river valleys, the Ganga, the Kaveri, where the soil was rich and deep, and particularly in areas with good rainfall. This spread seems to pick up from around the 6th century BCE onwards.
And you mentioned a technique called transplantation for rice.
Yes, paddy transplantation. This technique, where seedlings are grown in a nursery, then planted out individually into flooded fields, became more widespread, especially in parts of the Ganga Valley.
Is it difficult work?
Incredibly labor-intensive, back-breaking work. But the payoff is much higher yields per acre compared to just scattering seed. A major boost to rice production.
But the iron plow wasn't a magic bullet used everywhere.
No, its adoption was uneven. In semi-arid areas like parts of Punjab or Rajasthan, hoe agriculture remained common for centuries. And in hilly tracts like the northeast or central India, the terrain often made hoe cultivation more suitable anyway. Technology spreads, but it adapts to local conditions.
Beyond tools and techniques, what about managing water? Irrigation.
Irrigation was vital, especially outside the highest rainfall zones. Wells were common, tanks, essentially reservoirs, were built, and sometimes canals, though large canal systems seem less common initially.
Who built these?
It varied. Sometimes communities worked together. Sometimes powerful individuals, including kings, funded or organized larger projects. And kings definitely liked to record their contributions to irrigation in inscriptions. It showed them as benevolent rulers ensuring prosperity.
Like that Sudarshana Lake in Gujarat you mentioned, recorded over centuries.
That's a fantastic example, an artificial lake, apparently first built during the Mauryan period. An inscription by a later Shaka ruler, Rudradaman, records him repairing it after a storm, boasting he did it with his own money, without extra taxes.
A bit of political spin there, perhaps?
Quite possibly. Then, centuries later, another inscription on the same rock records a Gupta official repairing it again. It shows the long-term importance of such irrigation works and how rulers use them for both practical benefit and political prestige.
These improvements, iron plows, transplantation, irrigation, increased food production. But did everyone benefit equally? Did it create more inequality in the villages?
It almost certainly did. The benefits weren't spread evenly. Access to good land, owning oxen for plowing, having enough labor for transplantation, access to irrigated water, these things created differences.
So we start seeing clearer social divisions in the countryside.
Yes, the sources start reflecting this more. Buddhist texts from this period talk about different groups: landless agricultural laborers, small peasants who work their own land, and large landholders who might employ others. Tamil Sangam literature uses distinct terms too: velar for large landowners, uzavar for plowmen or cultivators, and adamai for slaves.
And that term gahapati keeps coming up in the Pali texts.
Yes, kahapati. It generally refers to the head of a household, usually a man, who owned or controlled resources, land, animals, maybe slaves or laborers, and had authority within the household unit. Often a substantial landowner, but the term could sometimes also apply to wealthy merchants or urban figures.
So control over land becomes increasingly important.
Absolutely central. And this is reflected in legal texts too, like the Manusmriti, which discuss things like boundary disputes between landholders.
That bit from the Manusmriti about burying secret boundary markers, stones, bones, charcoal to prevent disputes, seems a bit primitive.
It does sound rudimentary. Whether it actually worked is another question. But the fact that a major legal text felt the need to prescribe such methods tells you that defining land ownership and preventing disputes was a real pressing concern. Land rights were becoming more formalized and contested.
And from the early centuries CE, we get another crucial source related to land: inscriptions recording land grants.
Yes, these become quite common. Rulers granting land, sometimes whole villages. These grants were often recorded in inscriptions, frequently engraved on copper plates to serve as permanent legal documents.
Who usually received these grants?
Often religious institutions, monasteries, temples, or individual brahmanas. Most of the early grant inscriptions are in Sanskrit, but later on they start appearing in regional languages like Tamil or Telugu too.
That Prabhavati Gupta inscription is fascinating because she was a woman making a grant. Wasn't that unusual according to the legal texts?
It is interesting. Prabhavati Gupta was a very powerful figure, daughter of a Gupta emperor, married into the Vakataka royal family in the Deccan, and acted as regent for her sons. You're right, the Dharma Shastras generally suggest women couldn't have independent control over resources like land.
So how could she grant a village?
It might be an exception because she was a queen, effectively ruling, or it could suggest that the strict rules in the legal texts weren't always universally applied in practice, especially for elite women. It complicates the picture.
What do these land grant inscriptions tell us about the ordinary people living in the granted village? They weren't consulted, presumably.
Almost certainly not consulted. The inscriptions are written from the perspective of the ruler making the grant and the person or institution receiving it. But they indirectly tell us about the villagers, because it often lists the obligations being transferred.
Obligations, like paying taxes to the new owner.
Exactly. The inscription usually informs the inhabitants, peasants, brahmanas, other residents, that they must now obey the grantee and pay them all the customary dues, taxes, and possibly provide labor or specific products that previously went to the king or his officials. Sometimes the grantee was even given rights over mines or hidden treasures found in the village.
The Prabhavati Gupta inscription you included lists exemptions for the granted village of Dinguna, no entry for royal soldiers, no obligation to provide grass, hides, charcoal, flowers, milk for touring officials.
That list of exemptions is incredibly revealing. It tells us precisely what kinds of things the state usually expected from a village. Based on that list, grass, hides, milk, charcoal, flowers. What can you infer about the village economy?
Probably mixed farming. Some animal herding for milk and hides, maybe access to forests for charcoal and timber, perhaps some horticulture for flowers, alongside grain cultivation.
Exactly. It gives us a much more concrete picture of the rural economy and the demands placed upon it by the state.
Now, historians debate the significance of these land grants, don't they? Why were rulers giving away land and revenue?
Yes, there's a big debate. Several interpretations exist. One view is that it was a strategy to encourage the spread of agriculture into new, uncultivated areas. Grant land to brahmanas or institutions, give them incentives, and they'll organize settlement and cultivation.
Makes sense. What's another view?
Another perspective sees it as a sign of weakening central political power. Kings were perhaps losing direct control over local areas or powerful subordinate chiefs, samantas. Granting land was a way to create new allies, reward loyalty, or appease powerful figures when direct control was slipping.
So a political strategy born of weakness, perhaps.
Possibly. Or, relatedly, maybe kings were projecting this larger-than-life, divine image in their prashastis precisely because their actual control was becoming more fragmented. The grants and the praise poems might be two sides of the same coin, compensating for declining real power with symbolic gestures and alliances.
It sounds like even with land grants, large sections of the population might have remained outside this system.
Absolutely. Groups like pastoralists constantly moving with their herds, fisherfolk, hunter-gatherers in the forests, mobile artisans, people practicing shifting cultivation. They often operated outside the direct administrative reach of officials or the grantees of agraharas, of Brahmana land grants. And they rarely left the kind of records historians rely on. Their lives are harder to trace.
That little snippet from Banapada's Harshatarita, written around the 7th century CE, gives a rare glimpse of life on the edge of a forest settlement. It mentions small farmers using spades, finding plowing difficult, and people carrying forest produce like bark and honey to sell.
It's a valuable little window. It shows a different reality from the settled, potentially prosperous, tax-paying village targeted by land grants. It suggests harder farming conditions on marginal land and the importance of forest resources for the local economy. A reminder that rural life was diverse.
Okay, let's shift focus back to the towns and cities that were growing from around the 6th century BCE and the trade networks connecting them. Many started as capitals of those Mahajanapadas.
Yes, often they were political centers first, and their location was usually strategic for communication. Pataliputra on the river routes, Ujjayini on major overland routes, Puhar down on the coast for sea trade. Mathura became a huge hub because it was at a crossroads of several important routes.
Who lived in these cities, and what do archaeologists find when they excavate them, assuming they can?
Well, you had the elites, rulers, officials, priests, often living within fortified areas. But crucially, cities were also centers for craft production and trade, so artisans and merchants were a major part of the population. Excavations, though often difficult because many ancient cities are still inhabited today, reveal layers of urban life.
What kind of finds?
Things like distinctive, high-quality pottery. Northern black polished ware is a famous example from the early period, perhaps used by the wealthy. We find ornaments, tools, weapons, terracotta figurines, objects made from a wide range of materials: gold, silver, copper, bronze, ivory, glass, shell. It points to specialized crafts and access to diverse resources.
The story of Pataliputra itself kind of encapsulates the rise and fall of cities in this era.
It really does. From a village, Pataligrama, it grew into the huge capital of Magadha, then the Mauryan Empire, perhaps one of the largest cities in the world at its peak. But centuries later, by the 7th century CE, when the Chinese pilgrims Wanzang visited, he found it mostly in ruins, a much smaller town. Fortunes change.
Those votive inscriptions you mentioned earlier, gifts to temples or monasteries, they give us a snapshot of who lived in these cities.
They're fantastic for that. Starting around the 2nd century BCE, we find many short inscriptions recording donations. Crucially, they often mention the donor's name and occupation.
So what kind of jobs turn up?
A real cross-section of urban society. We see weavers, scribes, carpenters, potters, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, dyers, perfume makers, even garland makers and washing folk. But also officials, religious teachers, merchants, and kings making donations. It paints a picture of a complex, specialized urban economy.
And these craftspeople and merchants, they sometimes organized into guilds. Shrinis.
Yes. The term shrini appears, often translated as guild. These seem to have been organizations of craft producers or merchants dealing in the same commodity.
What do they do? Set prices. Quality control.
Probably things like that. They might have helped procure raw materials, regulate standards of production, maybe even collectively market the finished goods. Craft production, often using iron tools by this time, was clearly geared towards urban demand and trade.
And these towns weren't isolated. They were connected by extensive trade networks.
Absolutely. From the 6th century BCE onwards, you see the development of major land and river routes crisscrossing the subcontinent. And these networks didn't stop at the borders.
They went further.
Oh, yes. Overland routes connected India to Central Asia and beyond, and overseas routes became increasingly important. From ports on the west coast, ships sailed across the Arabian Sea to East Africa, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, linking India to the Roman world and West Asia. From the east coast, routes across the Bay of Bengal connected to Southeast Asia and even China.
Did rulers try to control these routes?
They certainly understood their economic and strategic importance. Controlling key routes meant controlling the flow of goods and information, and potentially levying tolls or taxes. Providing protection for merchants, perhaps for a fee, was likely part of asserting authority.
Who were the people actually doing the trading? Was it all big merchants?
It was a range. You had small-scale peddlers who might travel locally on foot, then larger merchants, sometimes organizing caravans with bullock carts and pack animals for long overland journeys, and then the seafarers, undertaking voyages that were definitely risky but could be extremely profitable.
Do we know what they called successful merchants?
Texts mention specific terms for wealthy or prominent merchants, like Masatuvan in Tamil, or Seti and Sathavaha in Pali. It suggests they were a recognized and respected group in society.
What kinds of goods were being moved around on these vast networks?
A huge variety. Everyday necessities like salt and grain moved regionally. Finished goods like textiles, pottery, metalwork were traded widely. Raw materials like timber, metal ores, precious and semi-precious stones traveled long distances. Plus spices, medicinal plants, ivory.
Spices were a big one, right? Especially pepper for the Romans.
Pepper from South India was hugely in demand in the Roman Empire. Textiles were also a major export.
That account you mentioned, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, the anonymous Greek sailor's handbook from the 1st century CE, it gives specifics about trade on the Indian coast, doesn't it?
It's an amazing source for that. It describes ports along the Indian coast, mentioning what ships came for, like large ships heading to the Malabar coast, specifically for pepper and malabathrum, a fragrant bark. And it lists imports and exports.
What kind of things were being imported and exported there?
To the Malabar coast, the Periplus mentions imports like coin, presumably Roman, topaz, antimony, coral, glass, copper, tin, lead. And exports included pepper, of course. But also pearls, ivory, silk cloth, gemstones, diamonds, tortoiseshell. It's basically a shopping list for merchants.
Why would the author write all this down?
It was a practical manual, a guide for other sailors and merchants planning voyages to the Erythraean Sea, which included the Red Sea, Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean. It told them where to go, what to expect, and crucially, what goods were valuable to buy and sell in different ports. It's direct evidence of the trade, and archaeology often backs it up, like finding Roman coins or bead-making workshops near the ports mentioned.
All this buying and selling must have been made much easier by coins.
Absolutely. Coinage is a game changer for facilitating exchange on a large scale. The earliest coins we find in India are the punch-marked coins.
Punch-marked? What were they like?
It's mostly silver, some copper, dating back to around the 6th century BCE. They aren't perfectly round, more like irregular pieces of metal stamped with various symbols, animals, plants, geometric shapes, maybe religious symbols. They're found all over the subcontinent.
Who was making them? Kings.
That's been debated a lot by numismatists, the coin experts. Some symbols seem to correspond to symbols used by later ruling dynasties, suggesting kings or states issued many of them. But it's also quite possible that wealthy merchants, bankers, or maybe even city authorities issued some of their own punch-marked coins.
When do we start seeing coins with actual pictures of rulers and their names?
That comes a bit later. The first rulers in India to issue coins with their names and identifiable portraits were the Indo-Greeks, who controlled parts of the northwest from around the 2nd century BCE.
And the Kushanas, known for claiming divinity, they issued a lot of coins too, gold coins.
Yes, the Kushanas are famous for issuing large quantities of gold coins, starting around the 1st century CE. And here's a key detail. The weight standard of their gold coins was virtually identical to that of contemporary Roman gold coins, the aureus, and Parthian coins.
Why is that significant?
It strongly suggests these Kushana coins were intended for use in large-scale international trade, fitting into the existing Roman and Parthian weight systems. Finding these coins across a vast area points to high-value transactions taking place across these interconnected regions.
Finding hordes of Roman coins way down in South India also speaks to that interconnectedness, right?
Definitely. It's powerful evidence that these trade networks linked regions far beyond direct political control. South India wasn't part of the Roman Empire, but it was deeply integrated into the trade that brought Roman gold there, likely in exchange for pepper, pearls, textiles, and other goods.
It wasn't just empires issuing coins, smaller groups too.
Right. Even groups described as tribal republics, like the Adhyas in Punjab and Haryana, issued their own coins, mostly copper, around the 1st century CE. It shows they were also participating actively in the monetary economy.
And the Guptas, they issued famous gold coins too.
They did. Gupta gold coins are renowned for their artistry, and especially the earlier ones, their high purity. These undoubtedly facilitated long-distance trade, and the wealth generated certainly benefited the Gupta state.
But then you mentioned from around the 6th century CE, finds of gold coins seemed to decline. What's the thinking on why?
That's another major point of discussion for historians and numismatists. One interpretation is that it signals an economic downturn, maybe even a crisis, perhaps linked to the decline of the Western Roman Empire, which reduced demand for luxury exports from India, leading to less gold flowing in.
So trade decline leads to fewer gold coins.
That's one possibility. Others argue it might not be a crisis, but a shift. Maybe new towns and local trade networks were emerging, and coins were being used more actively in circulation rather than being hoarded. Or perhaps states shifted their revenue strategies. It's not fully resolved.
This brings us nicely back to the historian's craft. We've talked about all these sources, inscriptions, texts, coins, archaeology. How do historians actually go from finding these fragments to writing a coherent story? Let's start with deciphering the scripts again. Brahmi.
Right, Brahmi is the ancestor of most modern Indian scripts. Deciphering it was a long process in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. European scholars and Indian pandits worked together, comparing letters and later known scripts back to older and older inscriptions. Princep's breakthrough in 1838 came partly from recognizing patterns, like recurring names and titles, especially Asoka's titles like Piyadasi, which helped unlock the whole system.
And Korosti, the script used in the Northwest. How was that cracked?
That was slightly different. The key there was bilingual coins issued by the Indo-Greek kings.
Bilingual coins.
Yes. These coins had the king's name and titles written in both Greek, which scholars could read, and Korosti. By comparing the known Greek text with the unknown Korosti text on the same coin, scholars could figure out the Korosti letters. Princep then used this knowledge to read longer Korosti inscriptions, realizing the language was usually a form of Prakrit.
Okay, so once you can read the words, the next challenge is interpretation. How do you figure out who's who, or if what they're saying is actually true?
It requires careful analysis and cross-referencing. Identifying rulers often involves matching titles, like Devanampiya, beloved of the gods, and Piyadasi, across different inscriptions until you find one that uses the title and the name, like Asoka, that links the title to the person.
And assigning their claims, like Asoka saying earlier kings didn't have good reporting systems.
That's harder. You have to evaluate the statement. Does it fit with other evidence we have about pre-Marcion administration? Is it plausible? Or is it more likely an exaggeration designed to make Asoka look like a great innovator? You compare it with other sources and assess probabilities. You can rarely be 100% certain.
You mentioned epigraphists use brackets in published inscriptions sometimes. Why?
That's about being precise and honest about the state of the source. Brackets often indicate letters or words that are damaged or missing in the original inscription, but which the editor, the epigraphist, has reconstructed based on context or traces of letters. It shows the reader, this part is an educated guess, not exactly what's carved in the stone.
Beyond just reading the text, there are bigger interpretive questions, aren't there? Like, who actually saw these inscriptions? Could most people read them?
That's a fundamental issue. Asoka's inscriptions were put on prominent rocks and pillars, maybe near towns or on trade routes. But how many people were literate? Probably a small minority. Even if the inscription was read aloud, was the specific Prakrit dialect used, understood everywhere across his vast, multilingual empire? And did the messages, his orders, or ethical exhortations actually change people's behavior? The inscriptions themselves can't tell us that.
The Kalinga inscription is such a powerful example of these interpretive layers. The one describing Asoka's remorse after the bloody conquest.
It is incredibly powerful. It details the horrific cost, 100,000 killed, 150,000 deported. It's often seen as the event that turned him towards Dhamma and nonviolence, a real crisis of conscience expressed on stone.
But there's a twist.
The twist is that this specific inscription, the one detailing the suffering and his remorse, is conspicuously absent in the region of Kalinga itself, the place that suffered the conquest. It's found elsewhere in the empire, but not there.
That is strange. What could that possibly mean?
We don't know for sure. Was the memory too raw, the message too painful, or perhaps hypocritical to display to the people who had directly experienced the violence? Does its absence in Kalinga tell us something different about its intended audience or purpose compared to where it was displayed? It forces us to think critically about why inscriptions were created and where they were placed. Even seemingly straightforward sources have complexities.
Which really underlines the general limitations of using inscriptions as historical sources.
Exactly. There are purely technical limits, Sometimes the engraving is faint, the stone is damaged, letters are missing. Decipherment isn't always certain.
And the meaning of words can change.
Yes, the exact meaning of words can be debated, especially if they were specific to a particular time or region. Plus, we only have a fraction of the inscriptions that must have originally existed. Many are lost forever. And even of those found, not all have been deciphered, translated, and published.
But maybe the biggest limitation is simply what got recorded in the first place.
That's the fundamental issue. Inscriptions usually reflect the concerns and perspectives of the people who commission them: kings, elites, religious groups, wealthy donors. They tend to focus on grand events, donations, royal pronouncements, achievements.
Not everyday life.
Rarely. The routine aspects of life, the daily experiences, the joys and sorrows of ordinary people, especially the poor or marginalized things, those things are largely absent. Inscriptions give us a top-down view, mostly. That's why historians must use them alongside other types of evidence. Archaeology, texts, coins, and always ask, whose voice are we hearing here? Whose perspective is missing?
And recognizing these limitations has actually shaped how the study of history itself has evolved over time.
Yes, definitely. The initial focus in the 19th and early 20th centuries was heavily on political history, using the newly deciphered inscriptions to reconstruct reigns and dynasties. Then, from the mid-20th century, historians started focusing more on economic and social history, trying to integrate archaeological and textual evidence more broadly.
And more recently,
there's been a growing interest in trying to understand the experiences of groups often left out of the traditional narratives: women, lower castes, forest dwellers, etc. This requires historians to re-examine the old sources with fresh questions, look for subtle clues, and sometimes acknowledge the profound silences in the record.
well, we have certainly covered a huge amount of ground today, journeying through this long and transformative period using the sources you provided. From the post-Harappan world, through the rise of states and empires like the Mauryans, the changing countryside, the growth of towns and trade.
And looking at how different sources, inscriptions, texts, coins, archaeology, each offer invaluable, though often partial, windows into that past. We get glimpses of rulers, elites, economic activities.
But as we've stressed throughout, these sources come with real limitations, technical challenges, interpretive debates, and crucially, the bias towards the perspectives of the powerful who created them. Understanding this history isn't just about memorizing facts from these sources.
No, it's also fundamentally about understanding how we know what we know, how historians interpret these fragments, grapple with the biases, and try to build a plausible picture, acknowledging the gaps.
Right. Which leaves us, perhaps, with a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder as you reflect on this deep dive. Given that so much of the past is simply lost or damaged or overwhelmingly told from the viewpoint of the elite, how can we truly grasp the lived reality of the vast majority? The farmers, the artisans, the women, the people on the margins whose voices are barely audible, if at all, in the records that survive. What crucial questions about their lives during these centuries of men's change might remain forever unanswered because the sources are silent?